here with Dr. Chris Chabris. Well, first, Chris, great to be with you again. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Great to be back.
So you wrote the book, The Invisible Gorilla, and we talked about it in our previous conversation. And I think, like with most things, I was late to the party. It was like 8 years after you wrote the book that I invited you on to talk about it. But now I'm having you on to talk about your new book with Daniel Simons called Nobody's Fool, which to us will be in bookstores in July. And to my viewers and listeners, I can say it was released today. You and Daniel Simons' first book, The Invisible Gorilla, was, of course, based on your study, later turned viral YouTube video, and it demonstrates selective attention and then goes on to detail many of the other ways that humans are blessed to have a rational line of thinking, and then also cursed with our blind spots and distractions that can lead to vulnerabilities and unawareness of important details. Cursed is my term, not yours. You and Daniel's new book, Nobody's Fool, seems on brand. And by my read, it demonstrates that when it comes to thinking and believing and reasoning, we pull from a habitual repertoire, and those thinking habits serve us well when they serve us well. I mean, they get us through the day, they make things feel fluid, but also make us vulnerable to being duped at any scale on any day. Is that a fair elevator pitch, or do you want to do me one better?
No, I think that's a great introduction. The two books that we published 13 years apart now are kind of related in the sense that The Invisible Gorilla was about certain cognitive limitations we have and the misbeliefs we have about our own cognitive limitations. So it's one thing to say that our attention is limited. It's another thing to say that we often act as though we don't realize that. So that was
right.
Sort of that contrast is kind of what gets us in trouble. In the new book, we've sort of flipped it around a little bit to say, well, we know that humans have cognitive limitations. They arise for good reasons. We have sort of efficient cognitive systems for getting around in the real world and doing the things that we've evolved as a species to do, but they're not perfect. And in fact, sometimes we're not aware that they're not perfect, or we're not aware how imperfect they are. And in this age of, rising tides of misinformation, scams, cons, false advertising, deceptive marketing, and so on, all of those kinds of people who are trying to take advantage of us in those ways are kind of exploiting the different holes that our cognitive habits have that make us vulnerable. And we're not arguing that all of those, that con artists are sort of like experts in cognitive psychology and they've studied all this stuff and, hit the textbooks, and come back with the recipe for success. Instead, just over time, people have, intuitively figured out how to take advantage of other people. And what we try to provide in the book is sort of a framework for understanding, how that happens, how we get taken advantage of, and therefore maybe what we can do to reduce our risk of being the victims.
Right, I like the way you said that, and it reminds me of, I'm not getting political one way or another, but Sam Harris's read on Donald Trump. It calls him an evil Chauncey. He's just an evil Chauncey Gardner. So like he's not even meaning to dupe you all, but he is, because of our inherent biases. Was his projection of Trump, but whether that's true or not, that could be possible. We could be being duped because we're duping ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, there's often some self-deception involved anytime that we're being deceived by other people. And yeah, I won't be getting political either, but I do think that some people are much more natural talents at deception and conning and scamming and so on. And there's a lot of interesting literature about what kinds of people, become con artists, scammers, whatever, and it links to maybe things like psychopathy, and so on. We don't really get into that too much in the book because one reason being we tried to sort of stick with what we're experts in, which is cognitive psychology, not psychopathology or psychiatry, but also because there's a lot of literature on that already. And there is a lot of fascination about, who are these people, who are able to carry on, long cons and pretend to be people they aren't for long periods of time and so on. That's a fascinating topic. I won't deny that, but there's a lot out there about it already. And none of that really helps us, I think, figure out, how to avoid this ourselves. It's great to hear everything Frank Abagnale, from Catch Me If You Can, did or claims to have done, right? There's now a controversy about whether his whole story of being a con artist is itself somewhat of a con. But regardless of that, like that doesn't sort of tell you like how to not, how to not be a victim or why victims fall for this stuff. So we really tried to sort of stick more to, more to that side of the equation and provide something that there didn't seem to be that much of out there. And that, brings some understanding, a little bit of understanding of cognitive psychology and how our minds work that people can use for practical purposes as well.
You have to be careful because I'll get my mind on tangents, but I didn't know there was a controversy over whether the cons were real or not. That's not the salient bit that of everything you just said.
Well, it's interesting though, but like, if someone claims to, I mean, in retrospect, it's kind of obvious that perhaps if someone writes a story claiming to be, the world's greatest con artist, they might be exaggerating or not telling the truth a little bit in the story about being the world's greatest con artist. Like, when do they stop and we can trust them, after for every time after that? I'm not an expert on this controversy, but I know there is a guy who has written a book where he went back and investigated sort of the claims of Frank Abagnale and so on, and tried to put them up against, what records and memories and documents and so on could say, and I think found some, to put it mildly, found some discrepancies, but I can't really go any further than that. It's one of the many books and stories about cons and scams and frauds that we didn't read when doing the research on this book. We did read hundreds of other stories about these things, but that was one of the ones we didn't get to reading in full. So maybe, after the book's been out for a while, we'll pick up that one some more.
Now, I don't recall, is that a phenomenon? So like Frank Abagnale had to do this huge, lifelong mea culpa. Like, sorry, and I'll give you my service to the FBI, and so like as soon as people disclose what seems like the most vulnerable aspects about themselves, is there something to that? Like, is there some reason that we would be more likely to believe that person, even though they've obviously lied before? Is that a get out of jail free card for a scam artist, I guess?
Well, I don't know if it's a get out of jail free for a scam artist, but it's definitely a technique that some, frauds or deceivers use to gain trust. So admitting to a small mistake, let's say, early on in a con or a scam, or let's say a performance, like, psychics and mentalists are kind of like, scammers in one way. They're sort of, pretending to, in many cases, pretending to do one thing while actually doing another. So pretending to be accessing, communications from your dead relatives while actually doing, a mentalist's cold reading, or while actually having looked up information about you beforehand online or something like that. They will often like toss in like a mistake or some uncertainty or something like that near the beginning as a way of sort of gaining credibility, because you figure, well, they admit to their mistakes. So now that they're not admitting to any mistakes, they must be getting it right. It's sort of, complete infallibility might be a little less trustworthy for some audiences, right? So they add a little bit of fallibility in there. Now, in the case of sort of like the long apology for, having committed a bunch of crimes and so on, I think there's all kinds of varieties of outcomes there, right? Bernie Madoff, for example, went to prison, said a lot of different things. Not really clear to me that he ever, how sincere an apology could one offer at that point? Like would victims of someone like that ever really believe, like, no matter how sincerely, hard to say. Everybody's going to have their own feelings about that. And it's really hard to judge. I think there are a variety of different end games for people who are caught doing this, doing that kind of grand scale deception.
Like, we're painfully aware that these things happen. And I think we're aware that they can happen to us, and maybe even do. Like, I am aware of this and I fall for them. Like, that's just the human condition, right? And I guess it's something akin to, like, I know that there's some likelihood that I could get in a car accident, because people do. But I never imagine when the car accident's happening, it's never me in the scenario in my mind. And even though I'm careful and I think about it sometimes. When I'm in the car, I think I have just this undue optimism that I'm not the kind of person who gets in those situations. I feel that must be something like that at play when I'm thinking about whether I'm being fooled or not, or whether I'm believing something real or not.
Have you ever been in a serious car accident or any kind of car accident?
No, and I imagine that if I were, then my bias might fade the other direction, right? So then,
Yeah,
like, everything's going to be horrible.
I think that might have something to do with it. Like I've been in a couple of car accidents over the years. I mean, one of them was clearly my fault, I would say.
Hmm.
I would say the other big one wasn't. And I was also oddly enough riding in the back of a taxi cab when the taxi cab got into a car accident. So I was, in a way, just a passenger on one of them. And I think that, once you've experienced it yourself, you may have a slightly different, feeling when you're on the road in the future. You might be sort of more attentive to the possibility. And that's one of the things we're actually trying to do with the book is obviously we can't go out and con all of our readers. I mean, I guess our readers could judge whether this book is a con. I don't think it is. We can't go out and con all the readers. But what we tried to do is like show so many different examples of so many different kinds of fraud and deception that all fell into the same patterns that we identify, sort of took advantage of the same cognitive habits and hooks, as we call them. We tried to show so many examples that we hope that people might gain a little bit of ability to recognize, when the signs are out there, even if they haven't been, the victim themselves. So I think, it's possible to develop your pattern recognition for sort of what are the warning signs of what's going on. It's also possible, I think, to be overconfident that it can't happen to you. Because when we read the stories of people who are conned, scammed, defrauded, fall for any of these kinds of things, we often think that the con was obvious. How did they not notice this? Right? Like, how did they not see this? How stupid must they have been? What was wrong with them? They were, sometimes it's attributed people were just too greedy. Like the greed was what brought them down. Like if they just hadn't been so greedy. I don't think any of those things are good enough to explain what's going on here, because many people who do fall into these things are quite intelligent, highly educated people, like high achievers in their professions. And everybody's greedy enough, I think, to fall for some kind of offer, right? Like some people need to be offered millions or billions. Other people just need to be offered, 10% on their money every year for the rest of their lives, which is the Bernie Madoff, proposition, really, which is a very pedestrian, rate of return for, an aggressive stock market investor. But the idea that you could count on it every year, and sleep soundly at night and not ever have to worry about your money was what sort of was really attractive. So is that greed? Is it desire for peace of mind? Is it, desire to protect your children's future and your retirement? I mean, who knows? It's all a long-winded way, I think, of saying that personal experiences, will change. I think will change your, attitude toward this, but it won't protect you like the way understanding how it works. And nothing will totally protect you either, right? I mean, but I don't want to be conning people about what's in this book, right? Like this is not a pill you take that like will prevent you from ever getting scammed. But I think it can reduce your chances once you understand more about how these things really work.
I like the Van Halen Eminem scenario. I've heard it before because I'm a musician, and I've never been cool enough for any venue to care that I ask for a particular kind of Eminem, but I know the story. And I think you're right in the introduction that, right, this isn't a perfect bulwark against any stage mishaps, but, I guess I should mention that Van Halen asked on the rider for specific color of M&M to be taken out of the bowl of M&Ms left. And then that was just like a signpost. If that wasn't adhered to, then we better check all of the rest of the stage equipment and all that stuff, because if the person didn't pay that much attention to that detail, maybe that's a cue. And it's not perfect. That's not because someone could very well say, look at the thing and say, let's make them happy, and then let's go do the stage work, and they could have made a million mistakes. But it gets you closer, right? And I think that's it seems like what you were saying your book could be, like a series of practical things that we can do to make ourselves a little bit sturdier in those situations.
Yeah, you can't be foolproof, right? Like to promise of being foolproof is sort of a mirage. But the Van Halen M&M's rider was an example of things you might be able to do to, I mean, one way of describing it is sort of outsourcing some of your vigilance, right? So they wanted to be vigilant against the possibility that, and to be clear, the deception in the Van Halen case is not necessarily anyone deliberately lying to or trying to con them, but perhaps, substandard crew, saying, oh
Right.
yeah, we took care of everything, when in fact, they didn't double check, the pyrotechnics, or they didn't triple check their rigging that like holds David Lee Roth up in the air while he's singing or something like that,
Just
so
a
it's
different means to
something.
the same fraudulent ending, though. It's like it
Yeah,
didn't have to
yeah.
be a
So
nefarious actor. Yeah.
yeah, exactly right. And it's and it was also self-deception, right? That they didn't want to just walk into the venue and think everything's going to be fine. We're looking forward to this, to this gig and the party afterwards, right? They wanted to have some way of, of keeping themselves vigilant, right? So they had this rule that there could be no brown M&Ms in their giant bowl of M&Ms and in their in their dressing room. And there are other things people can do like that, even if you're not Van Halen, right? One thing we suggest in the book is that when there's an important decision going on, have someone else look at it. Have someone else who's not already invested their own effort in making the deal look at it and give you an opinion on whether you should be following through. There's a there's a we don't talk too much about Jeffrey Epstein in the book. People have various opinions about him, and he's a multifarious
Mm.
character. But one thing he certainly was a deceiver. And in some ways he got sort of his start, or his career sort of had a little bit of liftoff when he got power of attorney for Leslie Wexner's finances. And Leslie Wexner was already a billionaire. He's the guy who owned Victoria's Secret and other fashion companies. And apparently the story goes, when Wexner sort of signed this over, his own vice chairman or chief financial officer of his own company said, this guy looks like a con artist to me. So he actually had someone telling him, that he shouldn't, put this guy in charge of his money or give him these legal powers, and he did it anyway. So getting
Mm.
other people like to opine and then taking them seriously, or at least thinking seriously about what they say, I think is one important way. You can't do that for every decision you make, right? But when the stakes are really important, it's probably worth investing the time and the and getting those other perspectives, right?
I like that did you put it outsourcing hypervigilance? Something like that.
Well, outsourcing vigilance. I don't know about hypervigilance, but outsourcing
Right,
vigilance, yes.
right. Outsourcing to vigilant, yeah. But I think about that. Like you mentioned, you asked me, have I ever actually been in a car accident? And I think I have, but nothing serious. But I know people who have been in circumstances like that, where my wife is a good example. When she was young, she was stuck in an elevator and she was very little, and so you had to crawl out of it and get help from somebody. So elevators to her all have the same 100% likelihood of that happening again, even though it's so unlikely. And I was curious as I'm reading, I'm like, how vigilant can I really be? These are good ideas, and if I put them all together, I could have OCD by the end of the book. But
Well, yeah, I mean that's there's you can go too far, and one of the I believe, again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I believe one of the one of the negative behaviors associated with obsessive compulsive disorder is checking everything too much, right? Like checking that your door is locked like 5 times before you can leave the house, and so on. These are sort of classic things that I think show up in like intro psych textbooks and so on. So you don't want to go to that extreme. We did talk to a psychiatrist that I work with while writing this book, and one question I put to her was, if someone really started checking more and more things because they were afraid of being scammed or conned, if they started becoming more and more vigilant, like could they give themselves OCD or something like that? And she said, no, it's like really like it doesn't work that way. You don't sort of like talk yourself into it,
that's fine.
by being worried about being conned or something like that.
Right.
So that's good news, right? You're not going to actually probably, give yourself a pathological level of compulsion or checking or whatever, but you don't want to go too far and become antisocial about it or do it in a maladaptive way. So, it would be a nightmare if you didn't believe anything you read, right? So we talk in the book about really the first point we make in the book is that we all have something that's called truth bias, and truth bias is a concept coined by mainly by philosophers, but also psychologists, and it's the idea that whenever we see or hear or encounter some piece of information or some statement, we automatically take it to be true. And some people argue that it requires extra effort to retag it or relabel it as false or uncertain or something something else. But regardless of whether it takes extra effort and how long it takes and so on, we do tend to act as though what we're being told is true, and that's necessary because we couldn't even have a conversation if we were constantly fact checking everything that everyone we were talking to said, or looking up the ingredients on every product in the supermarket and making sure that they added up to the right number of calories, and as my co-author Dan Simons gave the example of visiting the farms in order to see if the products are really organic, when you see them at the market or something like that, going back and interrogating them about their growing methods, with their and all that stuff. So you have to assume that, and you can't coordinate your actions or plan a meeting or really do anything without a truth bias. But the scammers, the marketers, the advertisers, the politicians, they all know, intuitively at least, that we operate this way. And moreover, they know some of the ways that the truth bias can be sort of harnessed. Repeating something, is a great way to increase people's belief that it's true. Because for one thing, if there is a truth bias and every time we hear it, we sort of, at least for a moment, think it's true, well, we're sort of repeatedly tagging it as true, and if on a few of those occasions there's some reason why our attention is distracted or we don't have time to investigate or whatever, maybe it'll get its way in there and it'll become, established as something we think is true, even if we don't know why we think it's true, right? We've heard it. And I think that can operate, why are advertisements so repetitious? Why do politicians keep saying that same thing over and over again? There's a lot of simple wisdom in that, but I think we don't necessarily think about that when we think about the concept of being defrauded or scammed or whatever. Like repetition and truth bias can be a big part of it.
That's a good point. Of course, the OCD comment was tongue in cheek. But in reality, did you know that? But in reality, like the fact is, it wouldn't have worked, is what I meant, to give a book full of do this through this, and you should be fine. It might work to weave in these concepts into like some sort of a life process of being more, even slightly more inquisitive.
I think that's actually a great point. To me, it's really a lifelong challenge and struggle to think more objectively, about the world. Like it's very hard, shedding your predispositions, preconceptions, ideologies, assumptions, and so on or even becoming aware of them, first, and then shedding them is not easy. It's not something you could just decide, I'm going to put that on my agenda for tomorrow. Like you have to constantly, in a way, be vigilant about, why, how are you thinking about, evidence that comes in? Are you really thinking objectively about it? Are you really weighing it rationally? Or are you just filtering it through some preconception? I think that sort of like takes a long time to get better at. It would be nice if you could just read one book and then everything's all set, right? But maybe that book instead can like try to give you some habits that you can practice over and over again, that will bring you closer towards that elusive ultimate goal. In this book we talk about how unexamined assumptions can be one of the main things that leaves us vulnerable to deception. Because often the way we get tricked is we have some fixed belief. We don't even know we have it, maybe, or at least we don't even know that it's critical to all of our later decision making. Again, I'll go back to the Bernie Madoff case, right? A lot of people lost so much money with Bernie Madoff because they believed that while there are con men out there and there are people who try to screw us and so on, Bernie Madoff would never screw us because my uncle got me into Bernie Madoff, or because Bernie Madoff was a big donor to this charity that I'm also involved with, or because Bernie Madoff is, everybody knows Bernie, right? Like he's the last guy who would ever screw us. It might not have been a terrible belief, at least probabilistically, to hold, right? Like of all the people around you, you might reasonably think Bernie Madoff is not the one who would, he wouldn't be the most likely to screw me. But the idea that he could never screw you, that's a commitment. We call that a commitment, right? That's a commitment that, you can then generate all kinds of rationalizations for what you see in his behavior in order to make it consistent with he would never screw us, right? And we see that a lot in politics too, right? If you're committed to one side, right, you can rationalize a lot of what they do on the grounds that, but they're right. So if they're saying X, then there must be some logic, to that, even if it seems on the surface to be contradictory, right? Well, there must be logic to that because their position is correct. So that, yeah, long-winded way of saying that questioning our own assumptions, I think, is critical, both for avoiding deception and also probably for just making better decisions, in all, in the rest of life.
First of all, I was reminded while you were saying that you'd be happy to hear I share an office with a colleague, and we were throwing stuff away. I work at a school, so it was the end of school, and we were throwing stuff away, and I was tossing it in the trash can. And I made most of my shots, and then there were a couple of papers laying on the floor, and he walked in and said, "You got to work on your shot, man." I said, "We only counted the misses." And he said, "You're
that's
really good at doing
a great
that."
example.
And I said, "I've been reading this book." Yeah. You talked about Bernie Madoff. You've brought him up a couple times, and I'm distracted by the newsworthy, mouth-watering like stories like that, Theranos, the Madoff scandal, and this is something I'm interested to ask. Do you see someone like a Madoff? Is that just a different flavor of the same kinds of things that we fall for? You mentioned commitment, like Bernie Madoff, if he was in the warp and woof of somebody's reality, like he knows my uncle, he donated to a charity, like he's real, I can trust him, I'm going to make an assumption. Is there something, I guess, different about the grandiose, large-scale sorts of cons as opposed to, like in your first chapter, you mentioned something more benign, like somebody who does cold readings. I don't know if that's benign or not, but it's certainly not like frauding billions of dollars.
Well, so yes, there are differences. I mean, I think we should draw a line between sort of like ethical magicians and mentalists and ones who, like, say, pretend to be psychics or pretend to have powers in order that they know they don't, in order
that's a good point.
Deceive people into thinking that. So a psychic, right, a TV psychic who knows that they can't talk to dead people, but pretends to talk to dead people in order to make a living, they can cause real damage. A magician who puts on a magic show in Las Vegas, can charge hundreds of dollars a ticket without really causing any damage because everyone knows that this is a performance. They're not trying to convince you that they, have magic powers and therefore they should be your leader or something like that.
You've agreed to be fooled.
There's the ethical, there's the ethical versus the unethical, but then there's also the scale, right? So which was what I think you really started your point with. Madoff is grand scale, right? Like that was going on for, by some accounts, 4 decades, right? 4.5 decades, maybe by others, 15 years. But either way, like to keep a con running for 15 years without being caught, is quite an achievement. And so what we argue in the book is that those really large scale frauds, the ones that sort of make for excellent podcasts and movies and, and documentaries and so on, they will exploit, whether they know it or not, many different of the cognitive habits and informational hooks that we talk about that fraud uses to get into our minds. So I just mentioned a couple of them in the case of Madoff, but we could probably go through the whole book and find examples for all the things we talk about in the book where at one point or another, Madoff was using that or his victims were, falling into something related to that. Same probably with things like Theranos. And I certainly have found that, like, as we were writing the book and after we wrote the book, I would see these news stories and say, oh, there's, this, that, and that, involved in this one. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at this or whatever, or I'm a genius, but I think you do acquire a new lens for understanding them. Some cons are relatively simple. they may be complex in sort of their emotional appeal and how but in terms of how they trick their victims, they can be relatively simple and maybe rely on only one critical idea. And the basketball, like the shots into the garbage can is a great one. You can do a lot just by exploiting the fact that we don't look at the information that's missing. Like, we don't think about the information that's missing. If we see 2 missed shots, we think he's a terrible shooter. If that's all we know about, right? We don't think maybe he made the 10 before that, right? And you can go a long way with marketing and other forms of deception that basically just use that plus truth bias. That's pretty much all you need.
What's your take on the line? These are impossible. Like, this is an impossible type of question, but I'm hoping you'll actually help me formulate it. So I'll ask it in an imperfect way. But the line in ethics between marketing, I guess, in earnest, in a way that people can agree, yes, I'm a human in a capitalist system who can be marketed to, versus fraudulent sorts of marketing. Do you ever look at that or think about that?
Well, we don't really sort of opine on the ethical lines too much in the book. I think we sort of leave that for the reader to to form their own judgment about. Certainly, there are laws and regulations about what marketers and advertisers can and can't say. Some of them are very specific, right? Let's say for the pharmaceutical industry, right? There are very much regulations on what you can say, can't say, have to say. Like, they have to list all of those side effects at the end of the commercials and so on. It's not. Although, and perhaps at first, and I'm speculating here, perhaps at first they thought, wow, that's terrible that they're making us list all these extremely rare side effects. But nowadays, of course, if they don't list them, you'd wonder what's going on. And maybe it also gains credibility. Like, look, we're admitting, like, in some cases, death has occurred, or whatever those phrases are that, might sound kind of scary on the surface, but then you hear it for pretty much every ad, like, so, so I think the ethical lines are not necessarily easy to draw, but one that I think I'm pretty comfortable with is, it's okay to direct people's attention to a limited subset of information, which is what pretty much every marketing and advertising effort does, right? They never say, here are the 7 million customers who have used our product, and here are the 13% who had, they don't go through like the totality of evidence about their product ever. They give you a couple of positive examples. I think that's okay if those truly are indicative of what the expected experience should be. And maybe also if you disclose the results not representative, and so on. Like, the disclosures, I think they're not perfect. And there's research in the behavioral sciences about what's the effect of disclosures. Do they really completely work to compensate for for the rest of the message? But I think where it gets ethically dicey, and where the powers of the advertiser, the marketer, are sort of at their greatest, is if they curate a very unrepresentative set of examples for you and leave you with the belief, which is the belief we would automatically tend to come to, that those are representative, right? So in the book, we have an example of and there's a lot of similar cases. So this one example I'm giving is not meant to, call out any particular company who does this, but a lot of people will say, this investment advisor, picked, in our example, Amazon in 1999 and Tesla in 2010, and he's about to announce his next stock pick. So what they've done is they've given you like, 2 amazing stock picks. Like, he picked Amazon, and then it went up like how many 1,000%, since then, and same with Tesla. And so what you're thinking of is like, okay, this guy was amazingly right twice. I would like to see what he says next. But what they don't tell you is how many picks he made that were terrible, how many great stocks he didn't pick, right? That's kind of like disasters that psychics didn't predict. Psychics have a terrible track record of not predicting a lot of important events in the world, and for that matter, like all the stocks that he never said anything about, and which, you don't really care whether you owned or not, which is most of the stocks, right? Like, no stock picker has an opinion on, most of the thousands and thousands of stocks out there. So instead, we're being directed to sort of the upper left corner of this little 2x2 table, where we have like things he picked, and things I definitely wish I would have bought when he picked them, right? And there's only 2 of those. Like, that should now, like, just having contemplated what must be in the rest of those, the rest of the boxes, of that little imaginary grid. Did he pick it, and how did it do? You can think that, actually, I don't really care what this guy says next, or at least I shouldn't pay. At least I
Right.
shouldn't pay my money to find out what he says next. And another interesting point, by the way, another piece of information that's being concealed when we hear stories about that is like, oh yeah, it would have been great if I bought Amazon in 1999, but then every single day after that, I would have had to not sell Amazon, right?
Ooh,
So I
right.
don't just have to make one right decision to buy it. I also would have had to make thousands and thousands of decisions, not to sell it, in order to now have the $1 million, that I could have had if I had, if I
I
bought
didn't think about
Amazon,
that. Yeah.
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 Every time you don't sell, like, that's a decision. Of course, many times people don't think about it every day. So it's not like it's not like every day they're waking up and deciding, should I sell my Amazon today? But if your Amazon was already up, like, by a factor of 5, you'd probably be thinking about selling it. Like, I better
Mm.
sell this and, get my money, and so on. And many of these stories about how if you had invested X in stock Y at year, Z, also include and never sold it, in
Right.
the 27 years since then, right? Which is that's a hard thing to do too. And you've got to have some kind of crazy, prescience, to know that you can't, you can't sell them.
What did you call, you talked about just a 2x2 grid? Was it, do you call it the possibility matrix? Is that what you
We
referred
called it
to
we
it as
called
in
it
the
the
book?
possibility. Yeah, we called it the possibility grid. Matrix sounded a little bit too sci-fi for
Grid,
for
yeah.
this, but
Yeah.
we didn't invent that. We didn't invent this this grid. It's actually sort of like a standard concept in psychology research,
Yes, that's why
in many ways.
yeah.
But we did sort of decide to label it the possibility grid because it's meant to direct you to, like, things that could possibly have been happened. Sorry, excuse me. It's meant to direct you to things that could possibly have happened, but which someone else doesn't want you to think about. So it's meant to
Sure.
sort of reveal to you what the other possibilities were. He could have recommended other stocks that you don't wish you had bought, like if he recommended pets.com, or something like that. I don't know if anyone remembers, but that was the company that had the commercials with the sock puppet that was driving, a truck or something like that. Or he could have recommended Google. And I'm surely if he had recommended Google, 15 years ago, he'd be talking about it now, you know, so he must not have recommended Google, and you wish you'd had that. So those are the other possibilities in that grid that you should be, you should look to. And this is truly like a universal tool for thinking about what critical information you're not being told.
Right. I work in the addiction field, and so constantly helping people with the decision-making grid, and just putting it usually not in a table. I'm not giving them worksheets, but it's just something to think about. What would be the benefits of making this change, or what would be the cons of making this change? What would be the benefit of making no change? What would be the downside of making no change? It's very standard. Like, now you've covered all your bases. At least you're asking the
Yep.
questions, and
Yeah.
so that's a good example of a simple tool that a person could use or pull from. So I had a question about I don't know which chapter this would fall under. Maybe commitment. So let's take an initiative at a workplace. Like, you could think of standard Dilbert comic strip. New initiative that I, N of one, don't. I'm either skeptical or believe something is definitely or inherently false or wrong about this. Yet, I can predict with some accuracy that everybody is going to fall in line, right? And so everybody around me has drunk the Kool-Aid. You're recommending there, at least you could at least put yourself in that in situations like this and think, all right, what's one additional critical question I could ask that might get me closer to. And so how might you, I guess, instead of giving advice to somebody, how might you navigate that situation to the extent that the thing keeping you from asking the question? So you're aware, there's a question to be asked. How do I thread the needle so that I don't come off looking like the douche of the party or
Well,
whatever?
that's tough. I mean, I think the broader category that this falls into, we call it. In the book we say we have a habit of efficiency. So we
Mm,
like to make decisions, quickly, with the least information we need. We don't like to sort of spend a lot of time digging up information for making decisions. We don't like thinking too hard. It's kind of costly, and so we tend to decide on the basis of the information we have in front of us. And The problem there is that often, due to the fact that we are often in what we might describe broadly as adversarial situations where someone else wants to do something, it's not necessarily what we want to do. For example, someone wants to steal all our money, it's not necessarily what we want to happen, right? They're not supplying us all the necessary information. Sometimes one more question, a good question or two, can reveal the information that we need to make the right decision. So going back to the Madoff example, not everyone who had the chance to invest with Madoff did invest with Madoff. Some people didn't. And some of those people who didn't were thinking about it, but they asked a couple of questions. And Madoff gave an answer they didn't like, or he refused to answer, which is also an important response to a question, or an evasive answer. Like all of those things should be flags that slow you down and say, well, wait a minute, if he can't answer this question, or he's not willing to answer this question, there's probably information that I'm not getting that would maybe change my view of things. So I should put this off. And some investors did that. They asked very specific questions. They didn't like the answers they got or the evasions they got, and they didn't invest. In a social situation where, like you described, where a lot of the people around you seem to be, if not in favor of what's going on, at least not in favor of rocking the boat, that's tough. I mean, if I knew the magic way to, break the ice in any social situation, and, I'd probably be a much richer person. But it's tough to be the one person who says, wait a minute, what's the evidence you really have that this is going to work? Or, did you think about, X? And in academic seminars, you can kind of get away with that. Like that's sort of what you're supposed to do, although it's still a little bit difficult and still can be frowned upon in some settings. But in a corporate environment, it can be hard. Sometimes you can ask sort of a more gentle version of the same question, like, what more can you tell me about that? Or, to tell me about the last time you did this or something like that. And sometimes you may inadvertently like sort of expose some information without seeming to be, too aggressively, going after it. One of my favorite questions that I first encountered, one of my scientific collaborators used to say this. Someone would be saying something in a meeting, and they would stop, and he would say more, or say more about that, or tell me more about that, which is almost like the most neutral question you can possibly ask. But just getting people to keep talking can sometimes reveal things that they weren't planning to tell you, right? Like their pitch stops here. If you just say more, they might now go off script a little bit, right? And tell you some piece of information that's really important to your decision making. Now, of course, in these scientific meetings that I was at, that was not the point. The point was really just to sort of, expose more of someone's thinking, more in a benign way, in an ethical way. But, if someone's trying to deceive you, if you tell them to keep on saying more, maybe they will give away maybe they will give something away at that point.
Now, you talked about studies that were completely fabricated. Well, in one sense, it was the first time I'd heard of this. My wife had heard of it, but it was the first time I heard of the art spectacle that was this band that didn't exist, the German rock band that didn't exist. It was so fascinating. But I guess I'm more interested in, gosh, now I can't remember his name, but the one who made claims about associations.
Maybe Diederik Stapel. Maybe Diederik Stapel is the one you're thinking of. Yes.
Right. Stapel is who I'm thinking of. And then I know people, so I can at least say in my experience, it doesn't matter that things have been, not only that they've become now falsifiable, but are falsified, like this was made up. People want to believe it. It's similar to the cattle in the business initiative. Like I either want to follow it or I don't want to upset the apple cart.
Yeah.
There's something about, like, especially when you brought up associations, people are more likely to X if X. That makes sense. I think I could see that in my own life. I guess what's up with that, and that's that's a self-deception, and I'm curious about how often I'm doing that too. Which headline am I reading and locking into my gains of knowledge? So at least so I think.
Yeah.
That I did because that's nice and that was tidy and fit, my preconceived notions.
Yeah. Well, so I'll draw a connection between, the fake rock band that never existed and scientific fraud. Like, why did we put those things in the same chapter? So, there are there's a performance artist a conceptual artist named Jamie Shovlin, who was a British artist who, for an artwork, created the entire archive of memorabilia of a band that never existed. And then he announced a museum exhibit of the archive of memorabilia of this band, but without saying that it was not a real band. So some people who came to the show like actually didn't get the joke, they didn't get the hoax, and they thought this was an actual band. And so there arose a belief or a false memory among a certain group of people that this band really had existed, and they had even seen them live and so on, but none of it was ever real. He was just such a good artist that he was able to create a hoax that many people believe. And there's a long tradition of hoaxes in all kinds of different genres, and we go through a few of them in the book. The scientific analog of a hoax is completely making up the data and results for a scientific study that you never actually conducted, but doing it in such a artistic way, let's say, that even the people who read your journal articles before they get published in the scientific literature can't tell that it's a hoax. Why do people fall for hoaxes like that? Well, that gets us back to concepts like prediction and expectation. So if you make up a hoax scientific study, claiming that there's a new planet and it's orbiting the Earth closer than Mars, and it's going to come and crash into us, pretty soon. Well, that violates a lot of, people's expectations and predictions and, previous assumptions and so on. So they're probably going to be skeptical. They may very quickly investigate this to see whether it's really true or not, and if it's not, they won't publish your article, or your article will be quickly retracted from the scientific literature if it even got in there in the first place. But if you create a hoax study that sort of perfectly fits in with the kinds of things people would expect to see, would expect would be discovered, you might get it published and nobody would ever look very much deeper into the data or into the patterns of results and so on. The expectations that we have can exert a very powerful effect on sort of what we see in what's in front of us. This is sort of partly what our old invisible gorilla experiment shows, right? Nobody's expecting that a gorilla is going to walk through this group of people passing basketballs around. They're not expecting a gorilla. A lot of them don't notice it, even though it passes right in front of their eyes. Well, if in the case of Diederik Stapel, who was a scientific fraudster who's had over 50 papers retracted from the psychological literature, what he was producing was not the psychological equivalent of new planet discovered, on crash course with Earth, but to give an example from one of his studies, if you are in a messy environment, like a dirty, unclean area of the city, you may have more racist thoughts. So linking the concept of sort of racist thinking to the perception of the physical environment. And at the time, these were the kinds of associations that people in this subfield of social psychology were very much expecting to see, and they thought were logical and well predicted. Now, I would say that Dan and I and many other researchers at the time, and especially since then, have come to doubt this whole idea that there are these strong connections between very subtle aspects of your environment and your deep thoughts or your behaviors. But leaving that aside, the way that Stapel was able to succeed as a fraudster or a hoaxer was because he was marketing his wares to an audience that expected things to be that way. And so they didn't really look critically. They didn't request to see his data, and analyze it themselves and so on. They didn't do what you would do if you heard that a planet was, heading for the Earth, right? Instead, they said, yeah, this makes sense, and accepted it in journals. And it took quite a long time for some of his, some of this fraud to be uncovered. And it was, as in many of these cases, the discovery, often comes from people who are not as committed to the idea. Like it sort of violates their expectations a little more, right? So then they have the incentive to, if not the incentive, at least they have the motivation, or they don't have to look into it, or they don't have the tendency to automatically believe it's true, right? So they will, then maybe be the ones who are more likely to spot mistakes. And this is a technique people can use in their everyday life, right? This is, in the intelligence community, CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and so on. They have this concept of red teams, which are people who are explicitly assigned to take the opposite view of the conclusion that the main, the blue team has reached, and see if you can see how convincing a case you can make for the opposite. So before the raid in Pakistan that killed Osama bin Laden, there was uncertainty about whether he was even in that house where they eventually, found him and shot him. So they put up a red team to look at all the same evidence and try to come up with alternatives. And even the red team, I believe, concluded it was about 50% likely he was there. And the government at the time, the Obama administration, decided that they had enough confidence to go and try, that it was worth the shot. But at least they were sort of clear-eyed as to the possibility that they might be wrong, and maybe some rough estimate of the chances that they would be, that they would be wrong. That's much better than just blindly going in and saying, "Here you go, Mr. Madoff, take all my money," and then going to sleep, and waking up, 10 years, 15 years later, and there it's gone.
That's a useful concept that people. That's one of those things that I think people are generally aware of their confirmation biases, but well, I don't know what the truth is about how often people try to argue their own biases, and especially with a third party look around. But it seems like fewer people do it than you would expect, given that they know that confirmation bias exists.
Well, that's especially ironic that here you have fraudsters getting stuff into the psychological literature, which is where confirmation bias, is written about, right, and so on, and taught. Like we, in the morning we teach our classes and we teach our students about confirmation bias. In the afternoon we go and we, review a paper and accept it for publication, because, in part because of confirmation bias, because
right,
we were, less probing, less searching investigators of things that satisfied our own expectations. Yeah, it's quite an irony there.
It makes sense at a personal level. Like I know psychologists who I counsel, so they come to me to be another person. Like, you don't have an investment in this, like you said. So what do you think I should do? So right, they can preach it, but then it's very hard to see in your own life. As a system of science, especially where the idea is like inherently built in is the concept of a red team. You're supposed to be able to. You're supposed to say, "All right, critique away."
It's supposed to be, and I think you made. I think what you just said evoked two thoughts in me. One, I'm no expert on this, and you tell me, but I think it's interesting how often therapists go to other therapists and maybe get advice on the cases that they're dealing with, or maybe on their own situations and so on. I mean, it's not necessarily a red team, but in a way, like, going for honest feedback from other people is, I think normally in a lot of times in the corporate world, the feedback is sort of so dreaded, and it's all concentrated in one annual meeting, and like it's something you have to steel yourself for, and and so on. But it should be more regular than that, and we should be more open to it, and maybe get disinterested parties rather than our own boss or something like that. I guess this is part of how the whole coaching industry, works and so on. But then also, like, you made the point that science is supposed to have sort of its own built-in red teams. We call them peer reviewers or seminar, audiences or whatever, who are supposed to poke the holes in what we've done. But I think the problem is that the red teams are not as red as they're supposed to be. Right? Like, often the peer reviewers come from the very same small sub area of the discipline, right, that the authors of the article come from. They're not supposed to have overt conflicts of interests. Like, they're not supposed to be in your own university, your own institution, your own lab, your own students, whatever. But still, there can easily grow, I think, a shared commitment to the general enterprise that they're all, undergoing. Let's say the general scientific perspective, like, subtle things in our environment can have deep effects on our on our thoughts, and some people even wanted to turn this into its own method of psychotherapy, to harness this supposed subtle influence of our surroundings as a method of psychotherapy. So it sort of stands to reason that they might not be as red a team when evaluating each other's work as they as they should have been. There has been this controversy in the scientific literature, especially probably in psychology, which is where a lot of these discussions are more developed than in other fields, discussions about replication, validity, fraud, and so on, I think are sort of more advanced in psychology than elsewhere. But there has been a discussion about it, if someone can't replicate someone else's experiment, could that be just because they don't have enough expertise to do it? Like, is there some kind of, again, subtle expertise that you can't really write down anywhere, but that the people who get these experiments to work know and have, and the people who don't get them to work don't have? And I think the idea that sort of like outsiders should be shut off from trying to replicate these things is bad, because it can create an insular, sort of environment where everybody is following the same methods, and they keep on sort of expecting the same things, and they become sort of, in a way, more vulnerable to the self-deception and outright exploitation by, let's say, a hoaxer, right? Like a hoaxer, a fraudster like Stoppel, that's like outright exploitation. But if there's also could be a lot of self-deception and just sort of like failure to notice one's own errors because they cut in the direction that you want things to go, right? So that's also a very common problem. If you the mistakes people make that don't get corrected add up to sort of favor their own position usually, and not the opposite one, right?
This isn't exactly the same thing, and I'll let you off the hook soon, because I've had you on it for an hour now. But I interviewed Charles Murray like soon after that he had his encounter at Middlebury College, where people were protesting, and I think they hurt one of the Allison Stanger, one of the professors. And he very kindly, he did the interview and said, "I think this might be the last interview like this I do, though," because he pointed out that he had to defend a lot of what he was. First of all, at Middlebury College, he was talking about a new book, not the bell curve, which people were protesting. And so then now he's in a position to defend something he didn't write. So he's trying to say, if you read the book, I didn't write the things that people are saying, but here's how they might have interpreted it. And so he's getting on, there's like an anti-racist kind of, won't let him into a community, you won't take him seriously. Luckily, he's a scientist and has social psychologists around him who will review his work. But then he's getting on, he finds himself shifted more in the direction of people who have this bent against the kind of person who would protest. So he finds himself in kind of like a scientific milieu, encroaching out in that territory, and he doesn't want any part of it. So I noticed that then first, I think.
What that stirs up in my mind is the idea that, often what happens is, everything is tied up in deception, in self-deception somehow. But often when someone's against us, right, when someone criticizes us, it can drive us into, towards people who want to defend us,
right,
even if they are saying all kinds of other things we don't necessarily agree with, right? So
right.
It's hard to stay in the middle and remain objective, right? Because you naturally, you naturally want to like and support and endorse the people who defend you. But sometimes your defenders are not the kind of people who you really want to be with all the time, right? Because they've got other agendas and so on, which is why like picking a group is a sort of a terrible thing to do for your chances of getting things right.
Right,
like as soon as you pick a group, right, you've got competing, you've got competing pulls, competing incentives, right? One is being with the people who like you, like they like you, they support you. That's nice of them, right? The other is being correct, and they may not, you may not think they're right about all kinds of things. I don't know what was in Charles Murray's mind at that time, but I think this kind of dynamic, I think, can happen in a lot of areas within academia and research and so on. And to the extent to which outside politics get involved in academia and so on, it can only sort of accentuate that, that problem. We don't really say much about that in our book, but I think the idea of expectations and commitments, which are very important in leaving us vulnerable to deception, I think can also just leave us vulnerable to generally being misled and being misinformed as well, which is a type of deception. Misinformation is in many ways a type of deception as well.
I have one more for you, and I think it was covered vaguely by things that we've said or through osmosis. I have one of the most regularly my regular guests on my podcast is Michael Shermer. Every time he comes on, I don't think he knows that I'm doing this. I work in the addiction field, and I don't know what that means. I don't like the addiction field. I don't like the racket that it is. But I do practical therapeutic techniques with people who are trying to kick an addiction, and people who are convinced that there's some like ineluctable drug inside of a drug that's chemically hooking them, and they can't do anything to avoid it. And so, like, okay, if you want to believe that, you can believe that. I'm not going to go too far on that hobby horse, but um, I happen not to. And even if I did, what can you do practically in your life that counteracts that? Um, the reason, the one downside of having that kind of belief is that well, you might be fooled into taking whatever magic elixir is offered that says it will ameliorate this
Yeah.
chemical thing that's happening. But when I've talked to Michael Shermer, we just like by happenstance talked about it, and I pinned him rightly or wrongly as somebody who's like drunk that Kool-Aid. So I give him like one little nudge every time toward my worldview, and like doesn't even notice. I'm hoping to eventually like 50 times on the podcast, and he'll believe me. That was a roundabout way of asking. Yeah, so I'm fascinated by how many people will believe in a magic bullet scenario when it comes to this field, and I'm sure there are just myriad others. Whereas, even though they're like particularly logical people and like have a healthy skepticism, like it might be the kind of person who would say Tony Robbins, well, that's all snake oil, and but yet the addiction antidote injection you could get that's real. And so I'm
Right.
curious about what draws somebody into such a mindset.
Well, I think we all have that mindset to some extent. So
Mm,
in the book, one of the we talk about four different hooks that deceivers, marketers, scammers will sort of try to use to draw us in, and one of them is this notion of potency, the idea that there are simple treatments or interventions or things we can do that have vast and long lasting effects, and there are some products like that that exist. One of the most famous ones is vaccines. So, there are vaccines for diseases that basically you take one shot once in your life, and your chance of getting that disease is almost zero for the rest of your life, or maybe zero, immeasurably different from zero, right? So there are some things like that that really do exist. Uh, but we like to believe that there are many more things than that, and it's logical, because if there were such a thing, it would have tremendous value, right? So if there were such a thing, we should use it.
mm, yeah.
Antibiotics, are another capable. Like there's some good examples, right, from medicine and from technology and so on. Antibiotics are a nice example, a sort of a single simple thing you can do, right? Just like take a few pills for a couple of weeks, and this disease that would otherwise kill you is neutralized, right? Um, but things like social policy don't work that way. More complex chronic illnesses don't work that way. Uh, Aging doesn't work that way. Like these complicated processes where you can't isolate like a single thing, like a virus,
Mm,
or a bacteria or something like that, and counteract it with a single chemical. Most things don't work that way. Even when things are more complicated, we tend to tell simple stories to explain why you should use them. So nobody really knows, as far as I know. Again, not a psychiatrist, but I do work with psychiatrists, and I know a little bit about this. We don't actually know how antidepressants work. I mean, there's a ton of research, on it, but yet, like, simple stories still show up in drug advertisements. Like,
yeah.
you don't have enough serotonin, but this drug will raise your serotonin. Well, that may be happening in some form, but it's still in dispute as to whether that explains the full story of why and how a drug like Prozac does modify your mood ultimately. And then but this sort of explains, I think, some of the ongoing appeal of the idea that you know there might be sort of like very simple interventions that we could do socially that would redress large inequalities, like why black students and white students tend to get different grades in college or something like that. There are some interventions people have promoted, which are basically like hour-long exercises that college students could do in their freshman year, which would sort of erase or dramatically reduce this achievement gap. And this achievement gap, is horrible, but it's probably caused by a lot of different things, that have been going on for generations and are going to really, sadly be hard to erase with just a very short, intervention. And when you go and look at sort of the evidence in favor of most of these quick, powerful cures, the evidence is really not adequate to come to the conclusion that these things work great and all we have to do is implement those. But they all appeal to this idea we have that simple, powerful, things exist out there. I think another thing that's involved in is something we actually touched upon in The Invisible Gorilla, which is the idea that we like our cause and effect models to have one cause and one effect. So if there's one cause of some problem, it makes much more sense that like a simple treatment could just fix the cause, and then the problem is solved. But if there's 20 causes for a problem, or 20 reasons for something, it's unlikely that one single thing is going to fix all those 20 reasons. And so we do tend to favor like simple cause and effect scenarios much, whereas a lot of our biggest problems are caused by so many different things that they need a much more comprehensive, longer lasting, more expensive response to deal with.
So if you believe a complicated problem actually is reducible to one cause, then it would be much easier to believe that there's one solution, right? Is that
sure? Yeah, sure. And like one telltale sign of this is often when people come up with a treatment that they claim works for some problem, you will soon find that they're claiming the treatment works for all kinds of other things too, right? That which also is a little bit illogical. Like there are not very many cases where, one change affects like so many different outcomes. Again, very rare, and hard to find. Unlikely that someone has discovered something for all of the different psychopathologies, that solves everything.
Well, just stop eating gluten. I'm kidding.
Well, I mean, also there's another obvious tendency is like some things that start out as like very legitimate, dietary issues, right? Like celiac disease and so on, right? They can get publicized to the point where people think that even if you don't have the disease, where this is a necessary step, it's still a good idea, right?
Right.
So
right.
The whole I had a student once who had celiac disease, and she had one paper she wrote for our class was about how she was sort of unhappy at how people kind of trivialized the idea of gluten-free diets, because for her it was sort of like a life or death matter, or at least a serious health matter.
Yeah.
She didn't like the way that it sort of was becoming for some people kind of like a lifestyle or just a healthy living kind of thing, where in fact it sort of has nothing to do with healthy living unless you have a particular disease, which is a serious, condition.
I can imagine. Yeah. So she gets pinned when she asks for something gluten-free at a restaurant is like one of those people,
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, exactly. Right. So, I mean, on the scale of things, like not the worst thing in the world, but a lot of these trends, I think, are indicative of, this underlying hook of, potency of tiny changes to create, big impacts on life and society.
Speaking of small changes that could create a big impact, first, thank you for talking with me. And I do have my last question for you is, I guess it's bookended. I maybe asked you at the top. Did you notice the gorilla and the real question is, how do you practice the balance of keeping strategies for being inquisitive and thoughtful top of mind? Although I think you seem to do that as a profession, maybe you have better practice than most, versus just letting things ebb and flow, having a comfortable flow in life.
I mean, it's possible that I have some inherent sort of tendency to contrarianism and questioning and so on. I mean, certainly my son seems to, and I suppose that must mean that I, in part have it, and and he got it from me. But I think it's really more been, like we were saying before, like a very slow process of, not to say you can't do anything about it, but a slow process of learning enough about the kinds of thinking mistakes we're vulnerable to, and seeing enough examples and gradually sort of like a professional athlete, like who plays enough and trains enough and learns enough, sees the field, differently from the way, you and I do as fans, or, an amateur, much worse than them at the same sport does. They see patterns, they see, people being slightly out of place. They see like the ball moving in a slightly different way, different spins, different speeds, all these things. And it's sort of instantly in their mind, they recognize an opportunity or a threat or something like that other people don't even notice at all, or, would take a lot longer to figure out. Someone would have to diagram it all out for them and draw arrows and so on. Then they'd be like, oh yeah, now I see what, well, you can gradually become better at your thinking, I think, that way, by seeing enough examples, reflecting on them, hopefully not making too many mistakes yourself, but those always do have, a positive teaching, teaching value. In games like chess, we learn more from our losses than from our wins. So I think that's the way to do it, is really just to do it over time. But mere experience, right, I think is not enough. So taking it back to the book, what we tried to do in the book was give people a framework for thinking about these kinds of experiences, whether they see them in movies or documentaries or news stories or podcasts about scams and cons and frauds and so on, or whether they happen to themselves, or whether they read some of the examples that we've tried to array in the book. You put them into the framework, and then you can see, oh yeah, I see that, these guys are trying to exploit familiarity and truth bias and, what I'm focusing on, to manipulate me. You start to recognize it that way. And I think that's definitely possible. I think it's possible to become more savvy that way, and then to ask the right questions, like, what am I missing? What are they not showing me? Why does this feel familiar? Is it because it's really credible, or just because I've seen it a lot before, right? You could start to make those distinctions, and then hopefully, avoid making the wrong decision.
I think I have a tendency already to ask those kinds of questions. But your book inspired me to think about the concepts in my own life. I make associations a lot anyway, so it was good. And I did finish the book. I warned you that I might not have time, and I was able to.
All right.
But thank you.
Great.
Thank you for coming on and talking about it. I appreciate it very much. The book is Nobody's Fool, Chris Chabris and Daniel Simons. And Chris, where can I send people off to links that anything that either of you put out that's worth seeing?
Well, we're each on Twitter. You can put our Twitter, our Twitter handles. There's a page for the book. Dan has a great YouTube channel that has a lot of the videos from these various experiments that he is and I've helped a little bit with over the years. Yeah, but I would just say go find the book. It's available everywhere that they're selling books, as far as I know. And there's a lot of, and don't miss the footnotes. There's always interesting stuff in the footnotes that might not have made it into the text. So we try to provide a lot of backing for what we're saying, and a little extra, further reading and so on. So I think people really enjoy seeing how this all fits together into one framework, and give some new insights on how deception really works.
I agree. I'll link to you in the show notes. I'm going to send people out to. It's July 11th. The book is in action. I think that's when we'll publish this, or maybe it'll be the day after. It'll be available when you're seeing.
Okay. All right. Yes. Exactly.
Thanks again, Chris. Best of luck.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. This was fun.